Melissa, you must begin Kylie's training. In the upcoming months, she will be replacing you in your position. My pulse thumping with shock, I gazed directly at Gerald Price and his buddy. This was how my dedication to Eastgate Manufacturing Group was being returned after 12 years of devoted work. As she examined her manicured nails and twirled her blonde hair around her finger, the woman sitting next to him couldn't have been older than 25. Gerald had presented her as my successor, but she hadn't even bothered to look up. No, I responded plainly, maintaining my composure in spite of the tempest that was building within of me. It was very quiet in Gerald's corner office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Phoenix headquarters, the desert sun cast long shadows across the conference table where my career was apparently being terminated. Gerald's eyebrows shot up in surprise, as if no one had ever dared question his authority before. Kylie Monroe finally glanced up from her phone, looking mildly interested in the drama unfolding. "Excuse me." Gerald's voice carried that dangerous edge I'd heard him use with vendors who dared to negotiate prices. I said no. I crossed my arms and maintained eye contact. I won't be training anyone to replace me without proper discussion about my future with this company. My name is Melissa Granger, and I'm 41 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been the operations manager at Eastgate Manufacturing Group, overseeing everything from vendor relationships to contract negotiations. I knew every system, every client preference, and every operational detail that kept this company running smoothly. When vendors called with problems, they asked for me specifically. When clients needed urgent modifications to their orders, I was the one who made it happen. But 6 months ago, everything changed when Gerald Price's investment firm acquired Eastgate from the founding family. The transition had been rocky from the start, with Gerald implementing cost-cutting measures that often backfired spectacularly. He'd already driven away 2 experienced managers, replacing them with younger, cheaper alternatives who lasted mere weeks before quitting. Now, apparently, it was my turn. "Melissa," Gerald said, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was diplomatic, "Kylie brings fresh perspectives to the role. She has a degree in business administration from Arizona State." I glanced at Kylie, who was now taking a selfie. "Does she have any manufacturing experience, any understanding of our client base or vendor relationships?" "That's what the training period is for," Gerald replied curtly. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was asking me to hand over 12 years of institutional knowledge to someone who clearly had no interest in learning it, all while pushing me toward the exit. But something in his dismissive tone told me this conversation was already over in his mind. The history between Gerald and me had been contentious from his first day at Eastgate. Unlike the previous owners, the Harrison family, who had treated employees like valued partners, Gerald viewed us as expendable resources. The Harrisons had promoted me 3 times during my tenure, recognizing my ability to streamline operations and build lasting relationships with our key accounts. I thought back to my conversation with Robert Harrison, the former owner's son, just weeks before the acquisition was finalized. We'd been reviewing quarterly reports in his office when he'd looked up from the financial statements with concern. "Melissa, I want you to know that your position is secure, regardless of who takes over," he'd said. "Your operational knowledge is irreplaceable. Any smart buyer would recognize that." If only he'd known how wrong he'd be. Gerald had made his intentions clear during our first staff meeting 6 months ago. "We're going to modernize operations," he'd announced, gesturing toward a PowerPoint slide filled with corporate buzzwords, fresh thinking, innovative approaches, streamlined processes. What he really meant was replacing experienced employees with cheaper alternatives. In the months that followed, I'd watched him systematically dismantle the relationships and systems that had made Eastgate profitable. He'd alienated our biggest client, Morrison Industrial, by attempting to renegotiate contracts that had been carefully structured over years. He'd switched to cheaper suppliers without understanding the quality implications, resulting in 2 major product recalls. Through it all, I'd tried to guide him, sharing insights about client preferences and industry best practices. But Gerald had made it clear that he wasn't interested in learning from the existing team. He wanted to implement his own vision, regardless of the consequences. The breaking point had come last week when I discovered his relationship with Kylie. She'd been hanging around the office for months, initially introduced as a consultant reviewing our operations. But office gossip travels fast, and it became obvious that their relationship extended far beyond professional boundaries. She'd been seen leaving his apartment building, accompanying him to business dinners, and now, apparently, being groomed to take over my position. I'd noticed her complete lack of interest during the few meetings she'd attended. While I was explaining complex client requirements, she'd been texting or examining her reflection in her phone screen. When vendors called with technical questions, she'd immediately transferred them to me without attempting to understand the issues. The woman Gerald wanted me to train couldn't distinguish between different types of manufacturing processes, had never read a contract, and seemed to think our biggest client was a clothing company rather than an industrial supplier. But she was young, attractive, and more importantly, she was his. "Melissa, I think you're overthinking this," Gerald continued, snapping me back to the present moment. "Kylie is eager to learn, and your experience would be invaluable in getting her up to speed." I looked at Kylie again, who was now applying lip gloss while ignoring our conversation entirely. The request wasn't just professionally insulting, it was a slap in the face to everything I'd built at this company. The realization hit me like a cold wave as I sat in that office, watching Gerald's expectant expression and Kylie's complete disinterest. This wasn't a training opportunity, it was a systematic replacement. He wanted me to hand over 12 years of institutional knowledge, client relationships, and operational expertise to his mistress, then gracefully fade into obsolescence. "What happens to my position after the training period?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Gerald's slight hesitation confirmed my fears. "We'll evaluate the organizational structure as we move forward. There might be opportunities in other departments." Translation: I'd be demoted, sidelined, or eliminated entirely once Kylie had extracted everything she needed from me. I thought about the Morrison Industrial contract I'd personally negotiated last year, securing a 3-year deal worth $8 million. I remembered staying late countless nights to resolve shipping complications, personally calling suppliers to expedite urgent orders, and building relationships with purchasing managers who trusted my word above any written contract. Now Gerald wanted me to hand all of that over to someone who couldn't be bothered to look up from her phone during a career-defining conversation. "I need time to consider this," I said, standing up from my chair. "There's nothing to consider," Gerald replied, his tone turning sharp. "This is a directive, not a request. Kylie starts shadowing you tomorrow morning." The finality in his voice crystallized everything. This wasn't a discussion or negotiation, it was an ultimatum: train my replacement or face the consequences. I looked around the office that had become so familiar over the years, the awards on the walls recognizing Eastgate's operational excellence, achievements I'd played a significant role in earning, the framed photographs of company milestones, including the groundbreaking ceremony for our new facility that I'd helped plan and coordinate. Gerald was willing to throw all of that institutional knowledge away for the sake of his personal relationship. He was gambling the company's operational stability on someone who had never worked a day in manufacturing, never dealt with the complexities of supply chain management, and never felt the pressure of meeting client deadlines. "I understand your position perfectly," I said, my voice calm but resolute, and my answer remains the same. "No, I will not train Kylie Monroe to replace me." Gerald's face flushed red. "Melissa, I don't think you understand the situation. This company is moving in a new direction, and if you can't adapt, then you'll need to find someone else to implement that direction," I interrupted, meeting his glare without flinching. Kylie finally looked up from her phone, seeming to realize that the conversation had taken a serious turn. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never faced real consequences. The problem, I thought to myself, was that Gerald Price was about to learn exactly how much he'd taken for granted. But that lesson would come later. 2 hours later, I was sitting in human resources with my termination papers spread across the table. Gloria Henderson, the HR director who had processed my promotion paperwork 3 times over the years, looked genuinely uncomfortable as she slid the documents toward me. "Melissa, I want you to know this wasn't my recommendation," she said quietly, glancing toward the door as if Gerald might be listening. "Your performance reviews have been exceptional, and your operational knowledge is, well, it's irreplaceable." I scanned the termination letter, noting the carefully worded language about organizational restructuring and strategic realignment. No mention of my refusal to train Kylie, no acknowledgement of my 12 years of service, and, most insulting of all, no severance package. "Effective immediately?" I asked, pointing to the date. Gloria nodded reluctantly. "Gerald wants a clean transition. Kylie will be starting in the operations department tomorrow morning." The absurdity of the situation struck me. They were terminating the person who actually knew how to run operations while installing someone who couldn't tell the difference between a purchase order and a shipping manifest. It was corporate suicide disguised as innovation. "I'll need to collect my personal items," I said, standing up. "Of course. Security will escort you to your office." The walk back to my office felt surreal. James, the security guard who'd greeted me every morning for 8 years, looked embarrassed as he accompanied me down the familiar hallway. Other employees watched from their cubicles, whispering among themselves. Word traveled fast in a company this size. At my desk, I began packing 12 years of accumulated memories, photos from company retreats, awards for operational excellence, thank you cards from grateful clients. But more importantly, I discreetly copied key operational documents onto a portable drive, procedures I'd developed, client contact lists I'd maintained, and vendor relationships I'd cultivated. Technically, this information belonged to me as much as the company. I'd created most of these processes from scratch, building systems that transformed Eastgate from a struggling manufacturer into an industry leader. If Gerald wanted to discard my contributions, he couldn't expect me to leave behind everything I'd built. My computer password was still active, giving me access to files that contained detailed information about client preferences, supplier relationships, and operational procedures that existed nowhere else. The Morrison Industrial account alone required knowledge of specific quality control measures, shipping protocols, and communication preferences that I'd documented but never formally transferred to company databases. As I worked, I could see Kylie through the glass partition, sitting in the conference room with Gerald while he showed her organizational charts. She was nodding absently while scrolling through her Instagram feed, clearly more interested in her social media than understanding the business she was supposedly ready to manage. "Take your time," James said quietly. "This whole situation is ridiculous." Even the security staff could see the insanity of what was happening. Experienced employees don't just materialize overnight, and operational expertise can't be downloaded like software. Gerald was about to learn that lesson the hard way. My phone buzzed with a text message from David Chen, a former colleague who now worked for Silverstone Industries, one of Eastgate's biggest competitors. "Heard about Gerald's latest decision. Coffee tomorrow? We should talk." David had been reaching out periodically over the past few months, subtly suggesting that Silverstone was expanding their operations division. At the time, I hadn't been interested. Eastgate was my professional home, and I'd been loyal to the company despite Gerald's questionable leadership. Now everything had changed. I finished packing my personal items, handed my building access card to James, and walked out of Eastgate Manufacturing for what I assumed would be the last time. But as I reached my car, I realized this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Gerald Price thought he could discard me like outdated equipment, replacing institutional knowledge with inexperience and loyalty with convenience. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. The next morning, I met David at a quiet cafe in downtown Phoenix, far from the industrial district where both Eastgate and Silverstone operated. He was already waiting when I arrived, scanning the morning news on his tablet while sipping coffee. "Melissa," he said, standing to greet me, "I have to say, Gerald's timing couldn't be better for us." David had been Eastgate's supply chain manager before leaving 3 years ago to join Silverstone Industries. He tried to convince me to follow him then, but I'd been committed to seeing through some major projects with the Harrison family. Now, sitting across from him in the morning sunlight, I wished I'd listened. "Tell me about the position," I said without preamble. "Director of Operations, reporting directly to the CEO, salary increase of 30% over what you were making at Eastgate, plus performance bonuses tied to client acquisition and retention." He slid a folder across the table. "We've been tracking Eastgate's struggles since Gerald took over. Some of their biggest clients have been expressing concerns about service quality and operational consistency." I opened the folder to find a detailed job description that seemed tailored specifically to my experience. Silverstone was planning an aggressive expansion into the same market segments where Eastgate had traditionally dominated. They needed someone who understood not just the technical aspects of manufacturing operations, but the relationship management that kept clients satisfied. "There's something else," David continued, lowering his voice. "Morrison Industrial has been in preliminary discussions about moving their account. Their purchasing manager, Patricia Williams, specifically asked if we had anyone with experience managing their requirements." My pulse quickened. Patricia and I had worked together for 6 years, building a relationship based on trust and reliability. Morrison's account represented nearly 20% of Eastgate's annual revenue, and Patricia had always valued the personal attention I provided to their complex orders. "They haven't made any commitments yet," David explained, "but they're clearly frustrated with the changes at Eastgate. Gerald tried to renegotiate their contract terms last month, proposing cost increases that Patricia found unreasonable." I wasn't surprised. Gerald had a habit of viewing client relationships as purely transactional, failing to understand the personal connections and trust that kept major accounts loyal. He'd probably presented Patricia with a spreadsheet analysis rather than acknowledging the value she placed on reliable service and consistent communication. "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "The position needs to be filled within 2 weeks. We're announcing our expansion plans at the Industry Manufacturing Conference next month, and we want our operational leadership in place before then." The Industry Manufacturing Conference? I'd attended that event for the past 8 years, representing Eastgate at vendor meetings and client presentations. This year, Gerald had planned to use the conference as a platform for announcing his operational modernization initiatives, with Kylie presumably playing a prominent role. The irony was almost poetic. While Gerald was showcasing his inexperienced replacement, I could be across the hall, representing Silverstone's competitive expansion. "I'm interested," I said, closing the folder. "Very interested." David smiled. "I hoped you would be. There's one more thing you should know. Our CEO, Jennifer Martinez, specifically requested this meeting. She's been following your career for years and considers you one of the most respected operations managers in the industry." We spent the next hour discussing the details of Silverstone's expansion plans, their client acquisition strategy, and the operational improvements they wanted to implement. Everything they described aligned perfectly with the systems and processes I'd developed at Eastgate, but with the resources and leadership support I'd never had under Gerald's ownership. By the time I left the cafe, I'd already made my decision. Gerald Price had discarded me without understanding my value. Silverstone Industries was offering me the opportunity to demonstrate exactly what that mistake would cost him. Within a week, I was officially hired as Silverstone's Director of Operations. The transition was seamless, almost too easy, as if the universe was correcting a cosmic injustice. Jennifer Martinez, Silverstone's CEO, conducted the final interview personally, and her enthusiasm for my experience was a refreshing contrast to Gerald's dismissive attitude. "We've been waiting for the right person to lead our expansion," Jennifer explained during our meeting. "Your reputation in the industry precedes you, and, frankly, Gerald's loss is our gain." Meanwhile, reports from my former colleagues at Eastgate painted a picture of mounting chaos. Kylie had indeed started in the operations department, but without my guidance, she was struggling with even basic tasks. According to Maria Santos, one of the production supervisors who'd remained at Eastgate, Kylie had already made several costly mistakes. She approved a shipment to Morrison Industrial that didn't meet their specifications, Maria told me during a quiet lunch meeting. Patricia Williams called 3 times, trying to reach someone who understood their quality requirements. Kylie kept transferring her to different departments. The situation was exactly what I'd predicted. Complex manufacturing operations couldn't be managed by someone without experience, regardless of their educational credentials or personal relationships with ownership. Client requirements, vendor relationships, and operational procedures had been developed over years of trial and error, guided by institutional knowledge that couldn't be easily transferred. "What did Gerald say when Morrison complained?" I asked. "He blamed the production team for not properly training Kylie. Then he sent her to a 3-day manufacturing seminar, thinking that would solve everything." I almost laughed at the absurdity. 3 days of generic training to replace 12 years of hands-on experience and relationship building. Gerald was living in a fantasy world where expertise could be purchased rather than earned. But my focus was now on Silverstone's rapid preparation for the Industry Manufacturing Conference. Jennifer had moved up our expansion announcement, wanting to capitalize on the instability at Eastgate while their major clients were reconsidering their options. "We're going to make a statement," she told me during one of our planning sessions. "Silverstone has always been competitive, but now we're positioning ourselves as the premium alternative for clients who value operational excellence." The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than attacking Eastgate directly, we would demonstrate superior capabilities and let dissatisfied clients draw their own conclusions. My role would be to lead operational presentations, showcasing the systems and processes that could provide the reliability and personal attention that Gerald was systematically destroying. Patricia Williams from Morrison Industrial had already agreed to a preliminary meeting at the conference. She wasn't ready to commit to changing suppliers, but she was clearly interested in understanding Silverstone's capabilities. Other clients were equally curious, having heard through industry networks about my move to Silverstone. 2 weeks before the conference, I received an unexpected call from Gloria Henderson at Eastgate's HR department. "Melissa, I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I wanted you to know that Gerald is planning to use the conference to announce Kylie as his new director of operations. He's scheduled presentations about innovative management approaches and fresh perspectives in manufacturing." The news didn't surprise me, but it did provide useful intelligence. Gerald was doubling down on his decision, publicly promoting Kylie despite her obvious lack of qualifications. He was betting his company's reputation on someone who couldn't handle basic client interactions, let alone strategic operational management. "Thank you for the heads up," I told Gloria. "Melissa, I hope you know that most of us never supported what happened. Gerald made that decision on his own." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the Industry Manufacturing Conference would become much more than a professional gathering. It would be the stage where Gerald's arrogance finally met its consequences and where my 12 years of expertise would find its proper appreciation. The morning of the Industry Manufacturing Conference, I stood in the lobby of the Phoenix Convention Center, wearing my best navy suit and carrying the confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The venue buzzed with familiar faces, vendors, clients, and industry professionals I'd worked with for over a decade. Patricia Williams spotted me first, approaching with a genuine smile that contrasted sharply with the polite but strained interactions I'd witnessed between her and Gerald's team. "Melissa, I heard about your move to Silverstone." "Congratulations," she said, extending her hand. I have to admit, I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Before I could respond, I noticed a commotion near the registration tables. Gerald and Kylie had arrived, surrounded by a small entourage of Eastgate employees. Kylie was dressed in a bright red dress that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a professional conference, while Gerald surveyed the room with the self-satisfied expression of someone who believed he was about to demonstrate his superior business acumen. "Is that Gerald's new operations manager?" Patricia asked, following my gaze. "That's Kylie Monroe," I replied neutrally. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "The one who's been handling our account requirements?" I simply nodded, letting Patricia draw her own conclusions. The Morrison Industrial account had specific quality control needs that required detailed understanding of manufacturing processes and careful coordination between multiple departments. Based on Maria's reports, Kylie had struggled with even basic order management. "Interesting," Patricia murmured. "Well, I'm looking forward to your presentation this afternoon. Jennifer Martinez speaks very highly of Silverstone's operational capabilities." As Patricia walked away, I felt a tap on my shoulder. David Chin appeared beside me, grinning broadly. "Ready for this?" he asked. "More than ready," I replied, watching as Gerald confidently led his team toward the main conference hall, where Eastgate's presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. Kylie trailed behind him, checking her appearance in every reflective surface they passed. The contrast between Eastgate's presentation and Silverstone's became apparent within the first 10 minutes. Gerald had positioned Kylie at the center of their operational strategy discussion, introducing her as the future of manufacturing management, while she read nervously from prepared notes that clearly described concepts she didn't fully understand. When a veteran purchasing manager from Davidson Industries asked about quality control protocols for specialized orders, Kylie's response was a rambling explanation about leveraging synergies and implementing innovative solutions. The audience exchanged glances, recognizing corporate speak that masked a complete lack of substantive knowledge. Gerald tried to rescue the situation by jumping in with his own technical explanations, but his answers revealed that he hadn't absorbed much operational knowledge during his 6 months at Eastgate. He confused supplier terminology, misrepresented delivery timelines, and made commitments about capabilities that Eastgate couldn't reliably provide. By contrast, Silverstone's afternoon presentation felt like a masterclass in operational excellence. Jennifer Martinez introduced me as their new director of operations, emphasizing my 12 years of experience and industry relationships. When I took the podium, I could see familiar faces throughout the audience, clients, vendors, and colleagues who knew my work firsthand. My presentation focused on practical solutions rather than theoretical innovations. I discussed specific examples of complex problem-solving, relationship management strategies that had saved critical accounts, and operational improvements that had delivered measurable results. When questions came from the audience, I provided detailed, knowledgeable responses that demonstrated a deep understanding of manufacturing challenges. The difference was unmistakable. Where Gerald and Kylie offered buzzwords and promises, I provided evidence and expertise. Where they proposed untested theories, I shared proven solutions that audience members had witnessed personally. After the presentation, the responses were overwhelmingly positive. Patricia Williams was the first to approach, but she wasn't alone. Other purchasing managers and industry professionals crowded around, eager to discuss potential partnerships and explore Silverstone's expanded capabilities. Gerald's revolution was colliding with my evolution, and the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. In retrospect, I see that when Gerald Price dismissed me for not training his replacement, he gave me the best present imaginable. He made me see my actual value and locate a company that prioritized experience above appearances. The finest retaliation isn't always what you do to someone. Sometimes it's succeeding enough that their rejection of you becomes their biggest regret. I didn't have to ruin Gerald Price in the end. I just let him ruin himself so I could create something greater.